Hello, Alan. It's really good to see you once again, and it's very kind of you that you taken time off to speak to us and to our students. That's the most important thing, but to speak to our students. And I hope this association carries on for a long, long time.
So do I. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Okay, so this is part of our MA course. It's a course which we call Stylistics, or Language and Style. And in fact, this video is called Language and Style. And what we want to do is give the students some basics about style and language. And so it's the MA students, and they've never encountered this kind of stuff before. So I think they're a little apprehensive. So we want you to make them comfortable. We'll try that in our print material, but we want you to make them comfortable with the video as well. So students love definitions, as you know. And so if you were to define style, how would you do so?
Well, let's try. Style is a very important concept, and perhaps the simplest way of understanding it is that it's about choice, that there are alternative ways of saying basically the same thing. And because we have those different alternatives available, we choose between them, and the particular one that we choose gives a particular flavour, and that's a style. So style is not so much about correctness and something being incorrect. It's not necessarily about good style and bad style, which are often ways in which anxious students think about style. It's really about alternatives and choice, and that's the key idea to keep in mind about style.
Okay. Maybe more relative clauses, or maybe something of that kind.
Yeah, let's take an obvious example first. If you took a contrast between Ernest Hemingway and Henry James, most people would be able to, if you did a game and said, well, here are two sheets, this one, one of them is by Henry James and one of them is by Ernest Hemingway, all you have to do is to say which one. Lots of people would be able to do that, and the way they would do that would be to mobilise stylistic intuitions. And so what a stylistician is interested in doing is saying, well, what are those intuitions based on? It's partly sentence length, it's partly vocabulary, it's partly content, it's partly the use of adverbials, it's partly aspects of word order, preference for passive constructions or left branching constructions. So that's when you use your knowledge of syntax, your knowledge of vocabulary, and bring that to bear on what the patterns are. But of course that's not only a literary thing. If you look, for instance, in the field of forensic linguistics, which is the application of linguistics to the law, sometimes the same sorts of issue arises. So let's say somebody threatens somebody else with a letter, an anonymous letter, and the question arises, well, now, who wrote this letter? It's possible, and there's some argument about how possible, but it's certainly possible for a stylistician to look at the letter and say, this letter shows all the same sorts of syntactic and lexical characteristics of a style that might have been written by, let's say, an ex-army man in his 1950s, and so in his 50s, as opposed to being written by somebody else, because it carries almost like a fingerprint, a stylistic fingerprint. And the problem, if I just wind that point up, the issue that arises in forensic linguistics is that many of the texts that the stylistician studies are quite short. And so we said a moment ago, we've really got to look at quite large bits before you can make generalizations. If you've only got, let's say, either a threatening letter or a suicide note, those are typically quite short documents. And so you can't say, well, this writer has a very strong preference for passive constructions if it's only 3 sentences. There's not enough evidence.
Yeah, but you are working somewhere in this direction, aren't you? So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, my work is part of my work is in this general area of forensic linguistics. But it's not actually about stylistics. I mean, there are a number of people who are quite prominent, particularly Malcolm Coulthard in Britain, who work in that area of descriptive stylistics. And they've contributed to a number of very prominent criminal actions where authorship has been contested. And they build on that whole tradition of author identification in literature, like, did Shakespeare write Pericles, or all these sorts of questions. My own work is rather different in that I'm very interested in questions of meaning. And so I'm interested in those situations in the law where people contest the meaning of an utterance. So let's say what did a contract mean? Is an advert a misrepresentation of the goods that are being depicted? Has somebody been defamed in some newspaper article? There are a range of situations in which people dispute what the meanings of an utterance are. And that usually goes to a tribunal or a regulatory authority or to the civil courts. And I'm interested in what kind of approach do lawyers adopt to interpretation, and how does that compare to the approach that we adopt in linguistics in, let's say, semantics or pragmatics?
So are you doing that as just research, or are you doing that as, helping a lawyer or helping the judge or whatever?
Yeah.
Or the police?
No, not the police, because most of these actions are civil, so the police are not really involved. I got interested in law. My background is much more in general stylistics and literary interpretation and discourse interpretation. I got interested simply by getting a phone call one day and saying, could you give us an expert opinion in a particular libel action which we have in hand, where somebody had used an expression, and the person that it was used about felt this clearly implied that they had lied. And the only defence that was offered, not was, yes, they had lied and it's true, which is a possible defence in defamation actions, but no, the expression is a colloquial expression and it doesn't mean that. It's actually complimentary and means that you have been very concise and precise. And so this court action was going to turn very narrowly on the meaning of that particular expression. And so I was brought in to do survey work, dictionary work, and other kinds of empirical research, which would lead you to be able to take a view and say, to most users of the language at this particular moment who would have read this newspaper, they would have been you can demonstrate that they would have been most likely to take it in one sense. And it was very clear in the research that I did that the vast majority of language users who would have read that newspaper thought it meant this person had lied in a professional capacity, and so the action actually was concluded in that way. However, you asked, is this just research, or am I involved as a sort of legal consultant? There are limitations in English civil law about the use of experts. You can have an expert about blood, what sort of blood. You can have an expert about DNA. You can have an expert about firearms, what sort of gun fired this bullet. But the court itself retains its authority about meaning and says the whole point of having a jury is that those people know the language, they know what things mean, and so they make their mind up. You don't need a linguist or a stylistician to come and tell you what things mean. And that's a very central question, not just in the law, but for linguistics generally, and for stylistics generally. What is it that we do in stylistics if we simply recycle what we knew already with statistics? And that's a question which perhaps we might want to go on and talk about a bit further.
Yes. Why don't we talk about it a bit further? So what do you think? Should we sort of leave it at that, or have it made useful in professions in various areas of life? What do you think about that?
I think there is a use for stylistics in a range of different walks of life. I think the difficulty has been that in many cases as stylisticians we've sort of oversold ourselves and claimed too much. So I can remember instances where people have sort of claimed that language is like a machine, and that once you understand how the parts fit together, you can produce a sort of style machine, and that will tell you what the text means. But of course the problem is that if you do any empirical work, as I do increasingly empirical work with groups of readers about what they think something means, what you encounter is that you take the simplest utterance and show it to 10 people and project something of a context, and you get lots of different readings. And this confident assumption that people routinely find a uniform meaning for utterance is very overrated. And so stylistics, I think, has suffered from. It's the victim of its own large claims. If we moderate the claims and say there are important differences of emphasis and of meaning and of nuance which style conveys, but that how people interpret things also depends on their background knowledge, their experience, their memory. If we take much more into account that social dimension of interpretation, then stylistics can make an important contribution, but not the only contribution, I think, to these.
It should be along with other things.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Getting back to literature a bit, students would probably be interested in knowing about, how do you stylistically differentiate a poem from a short story, from a novel and a play. I mean, some basic stuff like this students are often interested in, and they ask us questions of that kind.
So, well, I mean, students often have an anxiety, don't they, about how you differentiate things, and what they don't realise always is that anxiety is an insight. It's not a narrowness or a failure of insight. The insight that it captures is that there aren't always clear-cut ways. So, there are famous instances, aren't there, of creating a poem out of any other piece of text. So if you're giving them 10 random words, I can put them in a framework and they'll look like a poem. Or famous examples such as the one that the American critic Stanley Fish reports, where you use some words that are on the blackboard from the previous class, and you simply treat it as if it's a poem and get the students to interpret it as a poem, and they find all sorts of rich association connection. And what that plays on is that there aren't these fixed stylistic boundaries between poetry and prose, between non-fictional prose and fictional prose, and between drama. At particular periods, the differences are much more obvious. But the potential to do things in a form is very open-ended. So, I mean, the important thing, I think, is for students to see that they've grasped an insight, they've not got a deficiency when they say there seems to be a problem about how you tell the difference between poems. Poems aren't always in poetese, the strange language of odd word order and archaism. Poems can be consciously written in contemporary colloquial language, as everyone knows. So you can only talk about the style of poetry either for an author, for a particular collection.
Literary criticism is a highly technical area now, and it's almost obscure. It's like a lot of people don't understand it now. It's gotten into that kind of. And linguistics is also at a level getting obscure, when you get at a particular level. Students need a lot of help. So is there a meeting ground? What is the meeting ground? Why is it so difficult? Has stylistics contributed to the difficulty level? Has it made it simpler?
I mean, these are very big and complex questions. I suppose one hopefully valuable starting place is just for us to remember that while we think of linguistics as one field and literary criticism as another field, actually each is really a sort of complex mix of different people doing very different things, and that what they do isn't always compatible with each other, and that something of the obscurity and complexity when we're learning about each of those fields is that you're looking at things which don't all fit together. It's not like a jigsaw puzzle and you can't quite make the pieces fit. It's that it's a jigsaw puzzle with lots of pieces from lots of different jigsaw puzzles. And so part of the confusion that you can feel just reflects the complexity of the conversation that's going on in the fields. Now, having said that, that would be disabling rather than enabling, unless you can make something more of it. There have always been meeting points between literary criticism and linguistics, as there have between literary criticism and psychology and anthropology and other related fields, philosophy particularly. The history is a rather checkered one. So there's a period in the late 50s when you get to the Style and Language Conference in the United States, which brought together the big names of linguistics and literary study of that time, and tried to hammer out what the interface between the two was. The most famous paper from that event was Roman Jakobson's paper. Then you move on another 10 or 15 years and you get another conference which tries to do the same. And then I was involved in the late 1980s in organising another conference which sought to do the same, to mark well, what's happened in the last 10 or 15 years, where are we now? And what was interesting about that conference, which took place in 1986, was that, yes, there were still areas of dialogue, and that dialogue could be mutually beneficial, but the dialogue was peripheral to each of the fields. So linguistics has a whole set of research aims which were moving on, and that stylistics was at the side edge, in the margins of linguistics. And in literary criticism, the dominant trends in literary criticism have become not especially engaged with linguistics. And so if you look at a lot of literary criticism produced in the 80s and 90s, even though it talks about linguistics, the main figures of linguistics that are typically talked about would be Ferdinand de Saussure and Mikhail Bakhtin. And if you then go to a linguistics department and say, yes, I'm ready to do things now because I know Ferdinand de Saussure and Mikhail Bakhtin, people say, well, they won't really feature in our courses. Because that's not really what we think linguistics is. So although Saussure has a very important historical place, what people now understand by linguistics is something rather different. So one has to be very careful in looking at this language-literature interface. But
you have a major sort of, you need to go between, in a sense, between the two, the literature and the language. So what is your role and how do you sort of, maybe I've interrupted you, you can probably carry on with the argument.
I mean, I suppose I should correct the point about being a major figure. I mean, there's a small but I think very energetic field of people in a range of countries, in India, across Europe, and the people in the United States and elsewhere who work within this sort of interface area, which is not really stylistics, but is much more how we apply the insights of linguistics to the situations of teaching literature. So stylistics has sort of mutated from a descriptive analytic field into one that's much more engaged with pedagogy. And that's partly been a retreat because of the difficulties we talked about earlier in relation to statistics and science. And it's partly been an attempt to meet the challenge of using literature within language-driven courses. So, I mean, one of the central activities that I'm engaged in, I have sort of two identities professionally, I feel. One of them is this pedagogic identity. I do quite a lot of work with teachers where we either reshape courses or design materials. And the aim of those materials is to try to bring to attention much more than is usual both the contribution made by stylistic features of the language and features of background knowledge and inference in the ways that people make interpretations. So typically we create tasks or activities or gaps of information such that there's a problem in the interpretation which you can resolve, and that you resolve it by talking to other people in pair work or group work, or you guess, or you use evidence from elsewhere in the text. So that type of work is really to try to make more conscious these processes of stylistic intuition and judgment which are there. And then the other part of my identity, as I've already said, is about applying these same sorts of insights to other kinds of applications, such as legal, trade descriptions, or advertising.
Also music.
Yeah, I suppose music is another identity again in a way, and although there are lots of connections between language and music is a semiotic form, is music a language, all of those kinds of questions, I don't feel that the links between those different parts of my work are either as clear or as consistent as between these other areas. So historically they're different. I mean, I'm a musician also, and so part of the interest in writing about music has been because I play and wanted to make sense of the playing. I have a double bass. And it's not really part of that same academic project.
So, because we have Benjamin Zephaniah, because he just cancels on our thoughts with his band. So it is not you with your band or some such thing, or your music and your academics.
Yeah, interestingly, actually, that I played a lot and recorded and toured and did all the other things that musicians do, although there's much less of that, now because of other commitments. But interestingly, I always retreated from verbal communications, singing and so on in those contexts. So I always, or wherever possible, performed in instrumental musical forms and not with words. And that's a riddle. I don't know, considering I'm very interested in poetry, very interested in how language works, there's obviously some gap or block that makes me separate the musical performance as a non-verbal form from all this other activity with words. I don't fully understand it, but maybe I will one day.
Okay. I mean, we are all teachers of English literature and language in third world countries, and it is a second language. So do we need a special kind of orientation? Of course, our literature courses are now dwelling more on Indian writers in translation, African writers, Canadian, the Commonwealth Climate, new writings. But do you think there is a need for a different orientation? You teach in Britain, I teach in India. So, and you're an interface guy, so...
well, my answer is would be yes and no, and I know that's not especially helpful, so let me try to elaborate on the yes and the no. The yes is, well, clearly these situations are very different. They have different histories. They have different needs. My students are generally bilingual or working in a second language when they're studying English. Many of my students, most of my students are monolingual, native speakers of English living in the society that produced many of the texts that they study. So that's clearly a difference. And around those historical differences and differences of situation are then differences of purpose. What meaning does it have to study literature within the particular society? There's no real point studying a field that's completely abstracted or separated from the society of which it's a part. So you have to look at the network of connections that it makes with the society, and those are very different in Britain than they are in India. So in that way, yes, there's a different need. And if we just pick up, the term third world from the question, and that term itself has a history, the geopolitics of it moves on, and insofar as English is a critical field and engaged with social and political questions as well as linguistic questions, then we constantly need to be thinking about those dimensions, interrogating them, and yes, that will lead to differences. The no part of my answer, no, there isn't really a difference, is that I think there are similar challenges and similar problems in English studies, wherever you are in the world at one level. And those problems are about, those issues are about, what it is we think we're doing with the texts that we study. So traditionally we've had courses dominated by authors, dominated by prescribed texts, and we feel that we've completed the course when we've studied those authors. But what value do we add to our experience and the experience of others by studying the author? Well, we've read the book, so we've got familiarity. We've examined the book, we've examined the criticism of the book, and we can jump through various hoops which are set by the discipline. But it isn't so clear how that literary expertise which students develop connects with either their language expertise or their professional expertises, and many of them go into other sorts of jobs. And that's true everywhere. I mean, my sense is that the underlying core challenge for English studies is to try to make sense of the connections between looking at literary discourse, as illustrated by the range of books that we read, and thinking about social discourse more generally. And that's why, from the outset in this conversation, I wanted to emphasise that style is a concept which runs fully across. When you're thinking about style in literature, you're also enhancing your awareness about how language works and how social interaction works. When you're thinking about whether you say yours faithfully or yours sincerely at the end of a letter, as many people ask me, which do we say? And the answer is, I don't know, I'm afraid. When you're thinking about those kinds of social questions, you're also paving the way for your reflections about the different styles that people adopt in literature. My own sense is that one important feature for English studies is to identify these key bridging concepts. Style is one.
And it's going to inevitably happen, I think, with this whole business of globalization and global village.
Well, it could do. I mean, perhaps you're slightly more optimistic than me. I mean, if people increasingly identify and work with these sort of key concepts, we could have, I think, very, very exciting English courses in the future which are about language in use. So They deal with grammatical and stylistic issues, they deal with textual issues, and they deal with media issues. And that would be very, very exciting. The less optimistic position would be that as we look into that future, we get a bit frightened, and we retreat or retrench into the things that we know, and what we know are the canonical literary works, the humanistic values of literature as traditionally conceived, and that we have a sort of reaction against these developments rather than an embrace of them. I think that would be a pity. Naturally, I work as far as I can towards the other set of directions, but one just doesn't ever know.
Thank you so much, Alan. It was wonderful talking to you, and I'm sure our students would have picked up a lot of stuff from you. We look forward to you coming again next year, maybe, and we'll then pick up another issue that would interest us and interest our students. Thank you so much.
Thank you.